So you want your survey to be valid, because if not, then you don't have responses that actually mean anything to you or that you can use to do anything. So there are lots of things you should ask yourself, and there's 4 questions here, and then there's little pieces of information that we'll go through that you want to keep in mind too. So the first thing, you want to make sure that what do I want to know, that you're actually answering that question. You're not answering other questions. You just want to know what you want to know specifically, so make sure you've actually thought it out. You want to make sure you're asking the right people. Are you representing your population well? Did you just randomly select them because you felt like it? So make sure you're actually asking the right respondents. Are you asking the right questions? So again, are your questions relevant to what you want to know or not? And then what would I do with the answers if I had them? Would they address the things I want to know? So make sure that the way you design your questions, that you're going to be able to get information out of them somehow, some way. So are you going to be able to make a box plot? Only if it's quantitative data, right? Are you going to be able to make comparative bar graphs or something? Well, if it's categorical. So think about what you want to be able to get out of it to make sure you ask the right questions. So I'm going to go through some more specifics to make sure that everyone's on the same page. All right, so the first thing, these are all like paraphrased from your book, so I can go through some more things. But first thing is you want to know what you want to know. So make sure you actually have an idea of what you're trying to figure out before you start designing a survey. Sometimes people decide to do a survey and then they have an idea sort of what they want to know, but not really, and so they end up having this confusing, long survey that doesn't actually answer any of the questions they really wanted to know. Use the right frame. So be sure you have a sampling frame, appropriate list of people, and that somehow you're doing a sample of those people. Okay, don't just, again, just at random pick somebody in the hallway and then think that's going to be okay. Tune your instrument. Make sure that your survey is what you want it to be. Don't ask extraneous questions that mean nothing. The longer your survey is, the less likely people are going to be to answer it. All right. The next thing we want to do is ask specific rather than general questions. The more generic the question you ask, the more generic a response you're going to get. So that goes back to making sure you're asking questions that answer things that you actually want to know. Okay, so the more structured your question can be, the better, because that means you're going to get more of the response that you want. Ask for quantitative results when possible. Yes, it's easy to do like yes, no questions, but you can't do a lot with categorical data. We can do a lot of things with quantitative data, though. So if you can ask somehow some sort of numerical data, there's generally more you can do with that to compare. Be careful in phrasing your questions. If you are using like regional language, for example, if you're saying you're going to town, like if you went to town or something, going to town means different things, different places. Or if you're using a term that only is used in a certain area. So if you were saying, what kind of Coke do you like to drink instead of what kind of soda, different things mean different things, different people, okay? So just make sure you're phrasing the question so that everyone can answer it. On top of that, also try to be very careful about how you word the questions so that you don't make people feel embarrassed about answering it. You don't make people uncomfortable about answering it. You don't make it seem like you want a specific answer, right? So be careful. Phrasing can be a big problem even if you don't realize it. Even subtle differences in phrasing can make a difference. There's an example in your book I'm going to read through real fast. It says in January 2006, the New York Times asked half of the 1,229 U.S. adults in their sample the following question. After 9/11, President Bush authorized government wiretaps on some phone calls in the U.S. without getting court warrants, saying this was necessary to reduce the threat of terrorism. Do you approve or disapprove of this? And 53% approved. But when they asked the other half of their sample, the question was different phrasing. It said after 9/11, George W. Bush authorized government wiretaps on some phone calls in the U.S. without getting court warrants, so it leaves out the part about the threat of terrorism. Do you approve or disapprove of this? Only 46% approved. So by adding just different things into your question, it might sway your opinion. So be careful about that. And then be careful in phrasing answers. So if you're asking open-ended questions, you're going to get all sorts of random responses. If you're asking specific questions where there's choices, that's generally better. Or a rating system is generally better than asking a question where you're going to get some open-ended stuff, especially if you're doing a survey at our high school. Because keep in mind, you're probably going to survey freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. And even the seniors, even though they're your friends, if you're surveying them and you give them an open-ended question, you know they're going to write random stuff. And you know it won't mean anything to you, and you know you're going to get mad at them, and you won't know who they are because their name won't be on it. So make sure your survey, there's not easy ways to get on your nerves with the responses, okay? So you can see that there seems like a survey is a really easy thing to do, but there's a lot going into it, okay? The rest of the chapter is about things that can go wrong. So different types of sampling and different types of bias. So you definitely are going to need to know these definitions. Okay? Oh, and then side note, if you are going to do a survey, it's good to do a pilot. So if you're going to do a survey for your class project, then you might want to give your survey to a different group in class just to go through it and answer it to make sure that there isn't any bias or things like that. All right, here we go. What can go wrong or how to sample badly? So the first thing is you can sample badly with volunteers. So the first thing we're going to talk about is voluntary response samples. Notice I did not talk about voluntary response samples yesterday. We talked about SRS, stratified systematic cluster, right? A voluntary response sample is where you invite people to respond, but it's not required that they send it back. So surveys in magazines, surveys sent out on postcards, surveys on the internet, right? You're invited to answer the questions, but you don't have to answer the questions. That is not a valid sampling method. There are so many things that can go wrong with that. So because you have, as a voluntary, generally the answers and responses you get are only from people with a strong opinion in one way or the other. All right? So because you only get these strong opinions, you generally follow that up with you get voluntary response bias. If you have voluntary response bias, you don't get valid results from your survey. So if you're inviting people to respond, generally people that have a strong opinion are going to respond and everyone else will not. So be wary of voluntary response. Another kind is convenient sampling. And that's just when you survey people that are convenient to you. So if you're asking a question and you didn't set up some random method, let's say you stand outside the cafeteria and you just ask people that you see walk by, that's a convenient sample. That's not, again, it's not a valid way of doing anything. That's just because you're lazy and you're just going to stand there and talk to people. Or like if you're standing in front of my door and just asking people you wanted to as they walk by. That's convenient, but that's not random in any way. Okay? Questions about that? So be careful of voluntary response sampling and convenient sampling because both of those lead to bias. Also be careful of your sampling frame. So again, make sure you have a defined population of people and that you have, if possible, a list of people you're going to sample from. Because if you have this random sampling frame that isn't really complete, which happens in telephone surveys a lot, then you don't actually get a representation of the population. And this is huge. This will come up on the AP test, almost guaranteed. Many surveys designs suffer from undercoverage, in which that's when a portion of the population is not sampled at all, whether you meant to or not. Generally, you don't mean to, but you don't realize it's happening. So undercoverage, a portion of the population is left out. Like I said, there's two what can go wrong sections. So other things that can go wrong for surveys. Watch out for non-respondents. So non-response bias and then voluntary response bias are not exactly the same thing. They sound similar. Voluntary response bias is the result of a voluntary sample, but you can get non-response bias other ways. If you're doing a survey, for example, and you do everything right, you randomize everything, it's all good. You're asking every 10th person on the roster. You can't force someone to take a survey. You can't do it, right? You cannot make them pick up the pencil and answer your questions. So you never know that maybe some group or some people are not responding and their responses might be very important to you. Just be careful of that. Work hard to avoid influencing responses. So response bias, which is not the opposite of non-response bias, it's just a different term. Response bias refers to anything in the survey design that influences the responses. So if you word the question a specific way, whether positively or negatively, somehow you are influencing their response. Or let's say you are putting more emphasis on a certain part of the question or something, which makes them think that you want a certain answer. Right? So response bias, you're influencing their responses, whether in the question or in your demeanor or something. And then lastly, look for bias in any survey you ever see. If you design your own, you need to make sure you do a pilot so people can try to discover those biases for you. If you have a biased sampling method, you cannot recover from that. Your survey will not be valid. You can't do anything about it. So if you don't realize there's bias in your survey until after everyone has actually taken your survey, at that point it can't be fixed. Right? That's why you want hopefully someone to look at it before, try to help you in those places. If you can, at all possible, try to reduce bias if you know there's a potential for some. I'm going to do a pilot, and then always report your sampling methods in detail. So when you do your class project, and if you choose to do a survey, you'll have to do a write-up of your survey, and it'll include planning stages, how you implemented it, how you designed it, all of that stuff will be in writing. I should be able to, from your written part, be able to look at it and identify how you did it so I could repeat that, or I should be able to identify other sources of bias you didn't think of. So for this chapter in summary, we have 4 important sampling types. We have simple random samples, stratified samples, cluster samples, and systematic samples. Those are valid ways of doing a survey. Then you also have voluntary response samples and convenient samples, which are not valid ways of doing a survey. Then you have bias. The biggest one you need to know, you need to undercoverage, where you leave out a part of the population. Non-response bias, where people that don't respond may have had an influence on your results. And then response bias, you're influencing the way the question is asked or the way they're going to answer the question. All those are going to be important. Those terms come up on the AP exam. Those are not just terms in our book. Okay? So we're going to spend a little bit of time today doing some examples of the book, and then we'll spend a lot of time tomorrow doing examples. Any questions, though, about any of the terms that we just went over? Just in general. Okay. On page 288 is where all of the exercises are. Again, you can follow along if you want to. If not, I've got them on the screen. Whichever. I'm just going to do, I have 4. I'll probably do just 3 of them today. They don't take that long. All right, so number 1. Through their Roper reports worldwide, GfK Roper conducts a global consumer survey to help multinational companies understand different consumer attitudes throughout the world. Within 30 countries, the researchers interview 1,000 people aged 13 to 65. Their samples are designed so that they get 500 males and 500 females in each country. So part A is just asking, are they using a simple random sample? No. If you're doing a simple random sample, you wouldn't have 500 males and 500 females in each country, right? If you were just doing a simple random sample, they would somehow take everybody and just choose random numbers or something, right? But you couldn't guarantee the 500 males, 500 females outcome. Not possible. And part B, what kind of design do you think they're using? So of the other 3 that are remaining, what kind of design do you think they're using in order to ensure they get 500 males and 500 females? Stratified, right? So they're splitting the populations into groups and they're selecting 500 of each, okay? Does that make sense? You could also say there might be some multi-stage sampling going on because they're splitting it into countries first, and then they're splitting the country's populations into males and females. Questions about number 1? All right. Number 15. A local TV station conducted a pulse poll about the upcoming mayoral election. Evening news viewers were invited to phone in their votes, with the results to be announced on the late night news. Based on the phone calls, the station predicted that Amabo would win the election with 52% of the vote. They were wrong. Amabo lost, getting only 46% of the vote. Do you think the station's faulty prediction is more likely to be the result of bias or sampling error? So keep in mind bias. We all know what bias is. Sampling error is not a bad thing. Sampling error is just that every sample, whatever size you took, is always going to be different. So do you think that their wrong prediction is because of sampling error or bias? Think about what they did, how they did it. Is it valid or not? It's bias. And why is it bias? Right. It's voluntary response, right? You're inviting people to call in. That means you have to get somebody to actually call in with their response, right? Some people just don't care about politics. They're just not going to call. Some people aren't watching the news, and they don't want to pick up their phone and call in for a survey, right? So this is going to be biased because of voluntary response. If they had done it in a valid way, then you would have had sampling error. Does that make sense? Okay. 17 just goes back to review your sampling strategies, but then we're also going to talk about bias in these questions. So in a large city school system with 20 elementary schools, the school board is considering the adoption of a new policy that would require elementary students to pass a test in order to be promoted to the next grade. The PTA wants to find out whether parents agree with this plan. Listed below are some of the ideas proposed for gathering data. For each, indicate what kind of sampling strategy is involved and what, if any, biases might result. So you guys could have done the sampling strategy part last night. But then we're talking about bias. We have specific names now, so we're going to be careful of that. So on part A, put a big ad in the newspaper asking people to log their opinions on the PTA website. First of all, is that a valid way of conducting a survey? All right, so then what kind of survey method is that? Voluntary response. So that's a voluntary response sample. So then along with that, there could be voluntary response bias, right? On part B, randomly select one of the elementary schools and contact every parent by phone. What kind of sampling strategy is that? Cluster. They are going to randomly select one of the 30, right, and then do a census of all the parents. So that's a cluster sample. What are potential sources of bias for this, though? Even though it's a valid method, it's from one school. So we're talking about a big city, right? 30 schools. So that's not like what's happening in Murray, right? In a big city, there are different parts of the city, right? Generally, there's home schools for different areas that kids go to. So who knows what one school's type of demographic is compared to another? So that's not going to give a valid representative sample, but it's asking one school. You want to ask more than one school. Now, doing a cluster sample may not be wrong, but you want to do more than one school. You want to do 5 schools or 10 schools or something, right? All right. Send a survey home with every student and ask parents to fill it out and return it the next day. All right, so that's the bias. We're going to have non-response bias. But if they send a survey home with every student, what kind of sampling method is that? A census. So they're trying to do a census, but you're definitely have people that don't respond, right? And maybe their opinions are important. And then part D, randomly select 20 parents from each elementary school, send them a survey, and follow up with a phone call if they do not return the survey within a week. So that's stratified because they're picking 20 from each school, which is probably a good thing, right? Are there any potential sources of bias? Well, so they're sending one home, but then they're going to follow up with a phone call. So hopefully you're going to get a lot of them responding, right? I mean, they're trying 2 different methods. This probably wouldn't be, out of all of them, this would probably have the least amount of bias, if at all any, right? Now, Liz is right. You can't make everyone answer, right? Maybe you can't get a hold of all of them on the phone. But if it's your school, your child's school calling, generally you're going to answer the phone, right? So it's not going to be some like random 800 number that they're not going to answer. But so you might have a little bit of non-response, but most people are going to answer if they're asking those people calling them. Questions about 17? All right, one more. This is about wording. 2 members of the PTA committee in exercise 17 and 18, same question just asked, have proposed different questions to ask in seeking parents' opinions. Question 1. Should elementary school age children have to pass high-stakes tests in order to remain with their classmates? And question 2, should schools and students be held accountable for meeting yearly learning goals by testing students before they advance to the next grade? So in part A, do you think responses to these 2 questions might differ? How and what kind of bias is this? First of all, what kind of bias is it going to be? Response bias. If you're influencing the answer somehow, right? How do you think these answers to these questions are going to differ, though?
In the first question, all the people are going to say no because it has that emotional bias.
Right, they're telling them high stakes tests, and they're saying in order to remain with their classmates, right? Well, if you were asked that about your kindergartner, well, yes, I want them to stay with their classmates, right? I don't want them to take this test. That's dumb, okay? The second one is a little more, not so generic, but it's not so emotional, right? So they're kind of just saying, okay, there's this learning goal, testing students before they advance to the next grade. It's not saying anything about holding them back or anything like that, right? It's kind of more in the middle. So your responses are definitely going to differ. In part B, propose a question with more neutral wording that might better assess parental opinion. So you guys could think about that. This is the one I came up with. Do you think an exam is appropriate? You go back and think about what they were asking about. For deciding whether a student advances to the next grade. Because if you go back to 17, that's what they're asking about, right? They're asking about a test that would let them move on to the next place. So in like question 2 up here, it talks about advancing to the next grade, but it also talks about being held accountable, meeting yearly learning goals. That's more like educational jargon, educational speak, right? So maybe not all parents know what that means. You're trying to get it so that every parent can understand it and answer. So in the just very basic form of what they're asking if they think it's okay if their kids would take this test before and passing it before they advance to the next grade. That's what they're wanting to know. So that's my question was. I'm not saying my question is the best. I'm just saying it's not all educational ease, and it's also not super, super skewed to one side about, oh no, your kid's not able to go with their friends, right? I'm just asking them bluntly what they wanted to know. Okay?